my screen.
Loading. Yes, we can.
All right, awesome. So today and tomorrow we'll be talking about capturing and analyzing time in research, and that will form the focus of our discussion. So I have a riddle for you to start with. I am an abstract concept. I have no beginning. I have no end. What am I? What do you think?
Time.
Excellent. Yes, time. That is very correct. So time is a very amorphous concept, which we're going to try to tame in our lecture today and see how do we measure it correctly and how do we analyze it correctly. So we don't want to confuse equipment for measuring time with time itself. So a calendar is not time. A wristwatch or a wall clock, those are not time. That's not what we mean by time. Those are just equipment to help us measure time, which is a completely different concept. It helps to go back to, I love mythology quite a lot. I read a lot of mythology books, especially Greek and Roman mythology. And so the Greeks believed that Kronos was the father of, Poseidon, Zeus, and Hades. And, it was quite a very scary man. In fact, he swallowed his kids because he was obsessed with longevity. But the bottom line is that from Kronos, we get father of time. And from his name, we get things like chronometer or chronology or chronicle, which all have to do with time. Also, in Greek mythology, we learn about the Fates, the three goddesses that controlled one's lifespan. Clotho, the first one, was the one that initiated life. She spun the thread of life. Then Lachesis measured it, and Atropos cut it. And today we still see some remnants of this belief in fate. People talk about, it was his fate that he died so early, right? The concept of predestination, that somehow our lifespans have been predetermined, right? So the bottom line is that, mankind has always been interested, been obsessed with measuring time and looking at what factors could influence how long one lived or time to a particular event. Now, let's come back to the present. When we're looking at time or measuring time as researchers, there are three things that are baked into time that we really, really want to disentangle. We want to disentangle age effect, period effect, and cohort effect. Now, it's easier said than done, especially when we use cross-sectional data, because those three effects are interlaced. It's very, very hard to disentangle them, but we still attempt to do that nonetheless, because it's only then that we can correctly attribute what we are observing to a particular cause or set of causes. So let's talk about those three effects quickly. Let's understand what they mean. You can think of them as follows. Think of age effect as things we measure on an individual level. Think of period effects as things that affect all individuals at the same time period. And then cohort effects are things that will affect all people in a particular period. So everything that will affect a generation. So when we talk about age effects, we're talking about changes as individuals grow older and they mature. For example, we know that as people grow older, hopefully they gain more wisdom, right? And so the way they do things changes because their perspective on life changes as well. So that's what we mean by age effects. Period effects will be things that will affect everybody at the same time. So we think of, for example, the economy, the harsh economy now, right? It affects all of us at this same period in time. So that's a period effect. In this period of time, we all experience those effects simultaneously. But then with cohort effects, we're talking about, this particular cohort experienced certain things which might influence maybe some effects downstream. Talk about you hear of things like Gen Z or baby boomers, right? Those are different cohorts that had very unique experiences. When we talk about a cohort or a generation, we're talking about a group of individuals whose lives overlapped and who share some similar exposure. You might talk, for example, about the generation that saw World War One, right? You're talking about individuals who lived around that period of time and whose lives in some way overlap with each other. So we want to talk about in the research, we sometimes we're obviously very interested in cohort effects and trying to disentangle those three from each other. So let's look at the paper, for example. This is a paper led by that was written by Lungile and myself and another colleague a few years ago. The title says 20-year trends in tobacco sales and self-reported tobacco use in the US. So let's look at table one of this paper. Table one says total sales of various tobacco products in standardized units of cigarettes. In this table, what are we looking at? Are we looking at age effects? Are we looking at period effects? Or are we looking at cohort effects? What do you think? What does this table, what is it trying to capture? Age, period, or cohort? Are there any responses, Lungley?
Period effects, period.
Excellent. Yeah, so you're correct. So if you read the paper and people just say trends in blah, 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 they are almost always referring to period effects, even if they don't explicitly say we want to capture period effects, but that's what they imply. They want to capture period effects. But in the same manuscript, we also are interested in not just period effects, we're also interested in age effects and others. So let's look in the same paper also. We see the table two. Let's move on to table two. Table two says prevalence of self-reported tobacco use, blah, 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 right? And here we see results stratified by age. What are we capturing here now? Is it period? Is it age? Is it cohort? Okay. So we see a lot of people saying age effects, but do you think that what is captured here is exclusively age effects? What do you think? Does somebody want to raise a hand and explain? Okay.
Yes, someone raised their hand and lowered it.
Okay.
Panya. Samantha.
Sorry.
All right. So the primary thing we're trying to capture here is age effects, right? But it's impossible to talk about age effects in this context without alluding to cohort effects. Think of, for example, people who are aged 50 years or older. Apparently, those individuals belong to a different cohort. They belong to maybe a time when most people smoked and they've seen their friends who smoked die, and they are shocked by that and they say, okay, I'm going to stop smoking, right? So when you look at the prevalence of tobacco use here, you can see that it's lowest among this age group. Now, the question is, how do we explain that? Well, one possible explanation could be that as you grow older, you grow wiser just by age, just because you have lived long, right? And that in of itself makes you wiser, you make wise decisions. And so, for example, in this case, you stop smoking, right? Or you're less likely to start smoking if you haven't started. Now, that's a logical explanation. And that's purely the age effect in this context, right? That as you grow older, you mature, you become just a wiser person, and you make more rational decisions. But we cannot isolate or we cannot exclude the impact of cohort effects, right? Like we said earlier, it's possible that individuals who are aged 50 years or older, who are older in general, had some unique experiences in their cohort growing up. This has nothing to do with their being old per se. It's just the things that they've seen. And as coming from that cohort, they've seen again, for example, their peers die from smoking. So the experiences they've seen have shaped them, besides and independent of they're just growing old, right? So in this case, it's almost very hard for us to disentangle age effects in this context from cohort effects, right? But it's very important for us to know, at least have some idea of what's going on, so that we don't attribute some effects to a wrong cause, right? You might see, for example, that smoking rates are declining really fast. It's possible that those declines are attributable to one cohort being replaced with another. Maybe you had the old cohorts who were very, very heavy smokers. And what has happened is that entire cohort has just died off. And now you have a new cohort that just came from a generation that really wasn't into smoking, right? And so that new cohort has replaced the older cohort. And the impact is that you see lower rates of smoking, right? Now you can attribute that to say, wow, our interventions are so successful. And it's true that your interventions might be successful, but it's also true that what you might be having is simply a replacement of one cohort with another, right? So that's the reason why we need to be aware of those things so that when we're doing analysis, we can, to some extent, control for some of these things. When we do trend analysis, sometimes we control for example, you might read a analysis of trend saying, oh, we control for race and age while trying to look for smoking prevalence over time. The reason why they're controlling for age and race is that their hypothesis is that it's possible that the population composition might have changed over that period so that you're having, increasingly younger population. Or so let's look at an actual report to just show this in practice so that we're not just let's look at MMWR trans smoking. So you can see it. So it comes alive and let's see. Let's add adults. (2021), I want trends. This is just 22. Okay, yes, let's look at this one. All right, let's see. I'm looking for the text where they defined. Okay, this is not a very good. It's not a very good report. They don't really focus on the analysis of trends. Let me look for another one. Or better yet, let me look for Lungile's paper. Lungile, I believe that Lungile, today's you are a superstar today. All right, let's look for that. And let's look at this. So let's dissect the methodology and let's see some of the terminologies we use. And let's try and understand why we do those things. And let's tie it back to the concept of age, period, and cohort effects. All right, let's look at this. And let's go to the methodology. Okay. So, all right, we tested linear trends with logistic linear regression that use orthogonal polynomials adjusted for sex, age, and race, right? What we want to focus on here is that in analyzing trends, this adjusted for sex, age, and race, right? Who can explain to us what's going on? Why are we adjusting for age, sex, and race? We want to tie it back to the concept of age, period, and cohort effect. So remember, we said that if we're looking at trends from 2000 to 2020, what we're interested in is the period effect. That's what we want to isolate, right? We don't want noise from age effects or from cohort effects. So what's the hypothesis? Again, let's tie that to what we're discussing because I want us to really understand this concept. Why are we then adjusting for age, sex, and race? We want to capture period effects. Why are we adjusting for those variables? Any takers? This guy, why are we so shy? And I promise you, this is not a trick question. Okay, somebody says we want to find out if age, sex, and race affects the trend. Okay, good. I do say, please. You are muted.
Hello, Prof. You said the population may have changed over the period. And so if we are not controlling for the age, sex, and the race, it may affect the results that we get. And we may ascribe it a reason to a cause that is not the right cause.
Excellent. So remember what we're just interested in during this 20-year period, are our policies working in reducing smoking rates? That's what we're interested in. So in other words, we're interested in period effects, right? But here, imagine that we have a change whereby when we started at the beginning of the 20-year period, we had mostly old people. And then fast forward to the end of the 20-year period, we have a lot of young people. The population changed dramatically during that period of time. So of course we're going to see, of course we're going to see a change in prevalence. Of course we're going to see trend changes. Even if those trends are not attributable to a period effect, right? But the change in population composition has altered dramatically, such that we used to have a lot of old people who smoke a lot. They all died during the study period and were replaced by younger people. So during that 20-year period, a lot of things were happening, right? Maybe we had massive changes in immigration law, and so people flocked into there was an influx of people into the country with completely different smoking patterns. So we need to control for those cohort effects, right? And that is why we adjust for those things, depending on the case. So that's why it's important to be able to know. You need to know what you're doing when you're doing trend analysis, so that you can control for the things that matter. And if you're interested in period effects, well, you get period effects, right? So the underlying theory matters. You need to know why you're doing certain things, right? It's not just picking up a data set and clicking a few buttons and getting an answer. I mean, if that's the sole interest, we'll be done in the lecture in 2 minutes, right? We'll just say, oh, let's upload a data set, let's click these 2 buttons, and let's get an answer. But we need to understand the theory of why we do what we do, and the consequences for doing it or not doing it, right? So that's why it's important for us to understand those concepts, the concept of age, period, and cohort effects. All right. Now, even religious books talks about concepts of times, seasons, and cycles, right? For example, in scriptures, it might say, oh, I'm the God of times, seasons, and cycles. So this means there are differences between times, seasons, and cycles. So what's the difference? What are seasons? What are cycles? And what are times? Okay, let's start with the apparent ones. What's the difference between a season and a cycle? Because all of these things have to do with time. All right, let's break it further. What are some of the seasons you know of? Yes, Princess.
Hello.
Hi.
So please, with the seasons and then the cycles, I would say that cycle normally occur within
I think we've lost you. You've gone on mute. Okay. We can have somebody else then. Nsom.
Okay, Doc. Good afternoon, everyone. I think seasons are like particular times for particular events or phenomenon. That's how I look at seasons. Like the rainy season, we expect to have rain. The dry season, we expect the sun. And when we talk of cycles, I look at it like stages, or stages or steps that a phenomenon will go through, or something like that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let's make it simple, right? What's the common type of season you know of? Like you talk about this season or that season. Give me an example.
Rainy season, dry season.
Excellent. Rainy season, dry season, right? Or fall and spring or winter, right? Those are just phases. This passes, it's not as though one predicts the other or one causes the other, but they're just independent stages. What about cycles?
We have the water cycle, life cycle.
Excellent, right? So you have connotes the idea of something being cyclical, continuous change, right? Going on indefinitely. The reason why this is important is because as methodologists, we need to be aware of cycles. We need to be aware of seasons, and we need to account for them when we design studies. This is why in nationals, think of, for example, rainy and dry season. Do you think that there might be a difference in smoking behavior between the dry season or the rainy season, or between winter and, let's say, summer? Do you imagine there could be differences in smoking behavior between those periods of time? Of course there would, right? So when you imagine you're designing a national survey and you, in your great wisdom, decide to do the survey only in January or February, it's like, okay, your results are not likely going to be valid because you have failed to account for seasonality, right? You have failed to understand that behaviors change across the year, and that the behavior you see in January might be quite different from the one you'd expect to see in December, right? So that is why in large national surveys, we divide the sample into 12 and take surveys every single month of the year. Why are we doing that? Well, we're doing that to capture seasonality, right? So for you to be a good methodologist, you need to understand that there are seasons, and that seasons will influence behavior, and that there are cycles. Why do we need to know about cycles? Some cycles could be long, some cycles could be short. For example, in the US, economic cycles span every 4 years, right? So every 4 years, you go from recession to, recovery. So if you want to capture a phenomenon that is cyclical, you obviously must plan the data collection across the entire cycle. If you capture the data only at a small part of the cycle, let's say only 1 year, you obviously will fail to capture the entire phenomenon, right? This is why, as methodologists, we need to understand in great detail seasons and cycles and times, because especially if you're in the business of capturing time or measuring changes over time, then, well, it's your business to know about these things. So time refers to age effects in general. To put it very simple, seasons refer to period effects, and cycles, we can think of them as cohort effects. Obviously, this is not set in stone, but that's an easy way we could think about them. Now, our goal when we're doing trend analysis is to capture actual trends. So whether we're analyzing seasonal data or cyclical data, we want to capture trends, not fluctuations. Who can explain to us what the difference between those two concepts based on the picture we're seeing here? What is a fluctuation and what is a trend? Yes, Princess.
Okay, so please read which trends have patterns. So it can be an upward pattern, downward, or something like that. And then the fluctuations are irregularities that mostly happen. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Very, very, very good. Thank you very much. So who can tie it directly to the picture here? How does this picture capture the essence of a fluctuation versus a trend? Yes, Adeyemi.
Okay, so I would say that trends have a predictable pattern to it, while fluctuations are irregular or unpredictable. From this picture, the right picture shows a tractor pulling a tree, and it's predictable that when a tractor pulls a tree towards itself, the tree is expected to move towards the direction. But on the left side, we can see wind blowing a tree, and it's blowing it haphazard. If it blows this way, it blows the other way, and the tree moves. So you can't predict the pattern of the wind, which is what is inciting the tree to move. So I think that's the difference between fluctuations and trends.
Very good. Thank you very much. So so if we tie this illustration back to our story, the tractor represents what? Or the combination of what factors that we've just discussed now? We'll talk about 3 factors, remember? The tractor could be a combination of what factors? Yes, Bolanle.
Yes, I think the tractor will represent time. Since it's predictable, there's a time for tree cutting or something like that. Whereas the one with the wind should be seasonal. Maybe it's a harmattan wind that is, or the peak of the rainy season that's causing the trees to bow their heads.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so here this could show either a period effect, right, where maybe we've implemented a policy and during a period of time, and we're seeing a consistent, predictable decline in smoking, or we are seeing a cohort effect where people who smoked heavily are dying off, and we're seeing that predictable decrease as well, right? So in other words, this picture is different from this because there's an external factor that is actually causing the directional change we're seeing. Here it goes this side, it goes that side. It's noise, right? So our goal in analysis is to really separate noise from signal, right? You hear methodologists talk a lot about the noise to signal ratio. In other words, we want to separate the noise, which is just fluctuations, random fluctuations, from actual trends. So when we hear the word trend, we mean that there is a clear pattern here that we're seeing upwards or downwards, right? Regardless of direction, there is something that is behind it. So that is the whole point of doing trend analysis. So whether it is with a series of cross-sectional data or whatever data we're looking at, our goal is to show that indeed there is an effect, not just random fluctuations here. So why is this important? Well, because we do analysis of all type, whether it's for descriptive analysis or prescriptive analysis or predictive, right? Prescriptive analysis means we just want to describe trends from the past. We want to say, over the past 20 years, we saw that trends increased or trends decreased. That's what we mean by descriptive analysis in the context of time. Or just prescriptive analysis. We want to provide recommendations to say, here's what we prescribe based on our analysis of time. Or predictive. Predictive means that we're trying to predict some future events. We do a very bad job of predicting things in terms of extrapolation, right? Extrapolation means that we have some data and we are trying to speak far into the future based on what we've captured. So we have data for times A, B, and C, or times 1, 2, and 3. But based on those data points, we want to talk about times 7, 8, and 9. Right? That's what we mean by extrapolation. In general, extrapolation is just a guess, really. But in certain instances, we use this kinds of trends analysis to also look at predictions into the future beyond the scope of our data. That's extrapolation. So here, going back to this original paper, this is descriptive. We're just saying over the 20-year period, how did trends fare for cigarettes, both sales and self-reported data, right? We're just trying to describe what we observed, the phenomena we observed. Or we could want to make recommendations or prescriptive analysis that says, well, here's what we think should happen. So, for example, during the 2017 opioid epidemic, there were all manner of analysis that we did to recommend certain courses of action for the government to take, right? We looked at opioid rates and we said, okay, well, here's a trend we've observed. This is the observed trend. And if we had a consistent rise in the trends we had seen in the past, right, this is what will have happened. But since this trend went down, this is instead what we saw. And this represents the savings that we think are attributable if we continue this current management or this continual environment, right? In this case, we're not trying to predict into the future. We're just trying to say, based on what we've observed, here's some math we have done, and we think this is a strong signal that we should continue doing X or continue doing Y, right? So it's not necessarily describing the past or the future, it's just saying, based on what we've observed, here's some extrapolation, and this forms the basis for policy X, Y, or Z, right? That's an example of prescriptive analysis. So our job as people analyzing time is twofold. One, to make sure that we capture data properly for time. So if we're collecting data, making sure that we are capturing data properly. And then if we're analyzing data, making sure that we are describing changes over time properly, which could either be descriptive analysis, like just saying, over the past 20 years, here's what happened. Or it could be analytical, where maybe we had an intervention done at time T, and we're saying that, after the intervention, smoking rates decreased maybe by 20% compared to before that intervention, right? In either case, we want to make sure that we consider sources of bias and address them appropriately in our analysis. So let's focus on data capture. What are some of the issues that we might want to pay very careful attention to during data capture to ensure that they don't torpedo our data collection? We want to pay attention to issues of implausible ages, right? Remember we said time capture includes age, period, and cohort effects. We're very familiar with age effects because we capture age all the time. How old are you? We ask, right? But that's just one part of time. But it's a very important part of time that we want to pay very careful attention to when we're collecting our data. So we're going to look at some of those things from the perspective of data collection and data analysis, right? So that the way we collect time or capture time and the way we analyze time, they are both accurate. So we're going to look at how to control and allow for logic to prevent implausible values from getting into our data. We're also going to look at issues when we have multi-population surveys. Multi-population surveys are surveys where you have, as the name implies, different populations in the same survey. I may have a survey where I have infants and adolescents and older adults, all in the same survey. Think of NHANES, for example, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. The survey covers the entire lifespan. So from birth to death, everybody is covered. So in that case, if the age of somebody is reported as 7, what does that mean? Is it 7 days? Is it 7 months? Is it 7 years? Is it 7 decades? Any of those could be correct, right? Failure to capture it correctly means that our analyses are completely trash, right? So it's not when we're analyzing the data that we will say, geez, how do we make sure this is correct? It's when we're collecting the data that will put guardrails to prevent bad data from coming in. That's one example of something we want to pay attention to. And then another is the issue of inconsistent date formats. In different parts of the world, people use different age format, calendar formats. So, for example, in some parts of the world, it's month, day. In others, it's day, month, right? If you're doing a global data collection, you obviously want to make sure that you standardize those things so that you don't mix up certain dates. For example, if somebody reported the data of 0203, does that mean 0203? Does that mean February 3rd? Or does that mean 3rd of February? Complete different meanings, right? Which could have complete different implications for the data you've collected and the negative impact on validity. So we want to make sure that we do it right, that any capture of date time is valid and is consistently constantly done across all of the environments through which we are collecting data. The same thing applies to time and dates in terms of collecting apples and oranges for dates. Different dates might mean different things, in different parts of the world. So if you're collecting data for an event, like right now this is October 2nd, right? But it's not October 2nd everywhere in the world. In some parts of the world, it might be October 3rd. In some parts of the world, it might still be October 1st. So the question is, how do we benchmark data collection so that it's accurate? Especially when we are collecting things that have to do with deadlines, right? The same thing with time. If you're collecting data on time, how do you make sure people don't mix up military time, 24-hour clock, with a 12-hour clock? How do you ensure that it's consistent? If somebody reports 9 a.m. in Nigeria and somebody reports 9 a.m. in Atlanta, those are not the same thing, right? Especially if we're trying to measure, differences, right? Precision is very key here. So we're going to look at how we can make sure that the capture of time is always valid, because it's your responsibility as the investigator to put guardrails to make sure that you're collecting data in a way that is fit for use and fit for purpose. Then during analysis, there are specific things we also want to account for. We want to account for uneven time intervals between the years. So think of a data point, for example, that has the year 2010, 2011. So that means that between 10 and 11, you have 1 year difference. And then suddenly it jumps from 11 to 15. So you have 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 4 years differences. And then from here, you have, varying periods. When we do trend analysis, the assumption is that you have equal time intervals between time periods. So either you have 11, 12, 13, 14, where it's 1 year interval between them, or you have 12, 14, 16, 18, or whatever the interval is. We don't care about the interval itself, but we expect that the intervals are consistent from time point to time point, right? Well, in the real world, that doesn't always hold, right? Because, data were collected when the government had money. So the government was broke during this time, no data collection. And then when it had data collected, it was obviously a completely different interval relative to the previous ones, or even relative to the ones to come. We have to adjust for all of those things. We also may have data points that are too few. And obviously, if you have 2 data points, that's not enough to establish a trend, but we can still look at differences between those time points. And so we'll look at that as well and how we can tackle that. And then summary measures. A lot of trend analysis report changes, just like relative percentage change. It will say, there was an upward trend. The relative percentage change was XYZ. The problem is that the relative percentage change takes account only of the first year and the last year, right? We calculate it as a difference between the first and last year expressed as a percentage of the baseline year, right? We'll see the actual calculation in a minute. But if I had 20 years and you only took the first year and the last year, what of all the data in the middle? You mean those are not useful or what? Right? That's obviously a very shallow way of looking at trends. So I want to look at how to do it correctly. And then we have another problem, the issue of model misspecification. You might assume that as time changes, that the prevalence changes linearly. Because when you're looking at trends in smoking, for example, you are looking at the relationship between smoking and time. You assume that there's a linear relationship, right? But that may not hold true. The relationship may not just go straight like that. It might be curvilinear, right? There may be linear aspects, but there may also be curved aspects of it where it increases quite exponentially, right? simply put, the relationship may not be linear, but may be more of quadratic. So it might be necessary for us to account for that by including quadratic terms into our trend analysis to automatically account for that so that we don't have model misspecification. Otherwise, we end up like this, right? Where somebody's wearing shoes that have completely different sizes. This is what happens. This is how, you look like when you have a misfit model. When you assume, for example, that a trend is linear, when in fact it is curvilinear or quadratic. We're going to show how we can address for all of those things. Then obviously, if we're going to look at trend analysis, we need to append data, obviously, right? So we're going to look at some of the best practices in appending data. Now, the good news is that most of these things we've talked about, you don't have to worry about them, right? You don't have to worry about G's. How do I account for quadratic trends, or how do I account for uneven time intervals, right? The chi-square platform automatically handles all of those things. It detects them automatically, it handles them automatically. You don't even have to, you may not even be aware that there's a problem, but the platform handles all of those things. But you need to be aware of them. Well, because you're a researcher, you need to be aware of them because you might be teaching epidemiologic methods. So it's not enough to just click on some buttons and get results. You need to also understand the theoretical basis for these things, right? That's why we're going through all of them. If it's just a matter of just getting results, well, we'll be done by now. But that's what we're going to cover now. So now we're just going to go over to an applied setting and see, one, how do we create when we're creating surveys, how do we accurately and properly capture time in a way that there is no bias in our measures? And then we'll then switch to analysis and say, when we're analyzing trends, how does the platform allow us to capture those trends, and how do we interpret them? All right, so let's move over now and look at the more hands-on part of our lecture. For those of you who are new, we're going to use the chi-square platform. The chi-square platform is a web-based platform that allows you to do anything that has to do with research, from data collection to analysis to writing. So we're going to use it for our session now and see first how we can set up a survey in capturing time and make sure that we do everything correctly. And then secondly, we'll then jump into trend analysis to see how you can also do that on the platform. Any questions before we jump in? Any burning questions? If they're not burning questions, you can keep them till after our demo. All right, none, I guess. All right, so if you want to access the platform, you can sign up if you don't have an account, or you log in if you do. Oh, whoa, we have a question. Yes, Panyan.
Hello.
Hi.
Good evening, Doc. This is Panyam from Ghana. I think in your presentation, I saw something like you want to actually look at impact analysis. So assuming you have multiple interventions, how do you then evaluate the impact of such interventions with one outcome?
Okay. All right, we'll save that question and we'll answer it when we come to the analysis part, okay? But that's a very good question. All right, thank you. All right, now let's look at survey. So let's look at the questions, the issues we're trying to solve, right? For data collection, making sure that we put in guardrails to prevent accidental entry of extreme values of age. We don't want somebody entering the value of 200 when they want what they wanted to enter was 20. And so let's set up a survey, a mock survey, and see how we can implement that on the platform. So when you come to chi-square platform, this is the dashboard that you'd see. To set up a survey, you would come to data collection and come to survey design, and you click on start new survey. And so you have the options to do a cross-sectional study or a longitudinal study. Those are things you can set up after you have created a survey. I'm just going to click on start now and start the survey. So here we're going to put the title. So let's give a title like the factors associated with smoking. Let's say tobacco use among, I think we have a lot of people from Ghana here, so let me put Ghana, Ghanaian youth. So that's the topic we are interested in looking at. And we want to make sure that our focus now here is to make sure that we accurately capture age properly, or markers of time, not just age, right? So our location is in Ghana, and our project aims, let's generate the aims with AI. So I'm going to select those suggestions from AI. Oops. Let me add selected aims. Then I have a keyword. I have to provide one keyword at least. I can type it myself, or I can ask AI to suggest the keyword for me. So let's do that. All right, so these are the keywords that AI has suggested. I'm going to add them. So far, I put in the title. I selected my project aims with the help of AI. I also selected my keywords, also with the help of AI. And now I can proceed to create survey. These fields down here are optional. The platform is linked with an ethical review board, so that if you select any of these buttons here that they're applicable to your study, the platform will flag your study that it might need an ethical review clearance. But that's optional. I mean, you might have an ethical review board in your own institution. So that's why this is optional. But if I selected that my study involves children, that means the platform will flag that this study may need an ethical review. So now we have selected all the things that we need, so we can go ahead and click on create survey. Let's try again. All right, so now we have our survey set up. So you notice that we have the yellow banner here. Your study may require ethical approval, and that's because we checked the box that says that our study involves children or minors. If we wanted to go with the ethical approval from the platform, all we would need to do is click this button here, complete the form, and submit it. And that goes to an ethical review board in the US here in the state of Michigan called the Tassius IRB. But in our study, let's say we just have an ethical board in our own institution, so we don't need this. So we're just going to close this. Now we can create our question. Now, for the questions I'm going to create, I'm just going to focus on questions that have to do with time, so that we can see some of the common problems that arise and how we can tackle them so that we capture time correctly. So let's say we're trying to create a variable like, how old are you, right? Let's look at different ways we can create that exact same variable and see which ones might be better or which ones might be worse, given the context we have, right? So one option is to create a drop-down menu and have people select a particular value that corresponds to their age. For example, let's do this. Let's create a drop-down menu. A drop-down menu is a long list of items where an individual can choose one or more items from a list that is already fixed. So I'm going to select this, for example, and use selected question and ask the question, how old are you? Or let's say, in which year were you born? In what year were you born? Generally, when you're creating questions, each survey question must have 3 parts. You must have the question, instructions, and response options. Those 3 parts are standard parts of any question. So, in what year were you born? That's a question. But we must pair it with an instruction that says, for example, please select one option from below. That's the instruction. The third part of each question is the response options. The user must be able to select the answer from the available options that you have. When you are collecting data on the chi-squares platform, you have to provide a label. The platform automatically provides a label for you, but that label is what later becomes a variable name in your data set. You can change the label provided. You can, for example, use a suggestion from AI. So these are the suggestions that AI has provided for us. Some of them make sense, some of them do not make sense at all. I like this one, year born. So I'm going to select that. So you know in what year were you born. Now, let's add our response options. We obviously don't want to start sitting down here and typing all the years in the world. That will take us forever. So instead of user supplied entries, we're going to change this to system supplied options. We select that. And now we have to select one of those options that is supplied by the system. That's why it's called system supplied options. And here, let's select lower and upper limits. Lower and upper limit means that we will supply a lower limit and we will supply an upper limit, and the system will fill the values in between that lower and upper limit for us, so that we're not there typing all the values. So let's select that. Let's click this and apply. Let's select our lower limit as 1900, and let's select our upper limit as the year 2025. And let's have one step in between. One step means that we are increasing from 1 year to another 1 year to another 1 year. If we were to select 5 steps, that means we're jumping from 1900 to 1905 to 1910. So we're moving in increments of 5. But here, let's move in increments of 1 so that we capture data in a more nuanced way. In general, whenever you're collecting data, you want to make sure it's as nuanced and granular as possible. Because if it's granular, you can collapse it later if you want. But if you collect it in a way that was so broad, there's nothing you can do about that anymore. So here we have we've asked our question. Again, remember, each question must have 3 parts: the question, the instruction, and the answers, the answer options. So we have our question, the instructions, and the answer options. This preview gives you an idea of how the question will look like when participants are taking it. So you can see in what year were you born. Please select one option from below. You see the options are there. The user can then select whatever they want and answer it accordingly, right? Depending on whatever the answer is, they can then select accordingly. So this is how our question will be. So now that we've created that question, now we can push it to questionnaire so that it becomes an additional question added. So now we have one question added. That's how we can create a question that has to do with time. Well, as you can see here, the advantages of this approach is that it allows us to capture the year of birth in a way that lies between plausible values, right? Somebody cannot say they were born in 1842 because we've limited the options to what the user can supply. The disadvantage of this kind of approach is that we have only provided years, the year of birth, right? We don't have that nuance to capture information on month or day. And in some instances, we might be interested in the month they were actually born, right? So this approach does not allow us to do that. So let's look at another option that we could use to capture, right? Years. Let's create another question, also focus on capturing the year of birth. This time, instead of using a drop-down menu question as we did before, let's use an open-ended question. Open-ended questions, as the name implies, are questions that are open-ended, meaning that we are not giving the user a fixed set of options to pick from. In the previous example, we gave the user a fixed set of options. We said you can only pick a year from 1900 to 2025, right? So they are clicking to select. An open-ended question here, the user must have to type an answer. They're not just clicking, they have to type an answer to have it recorded. So let's select a single value response under open-ended. Single value because the user is typing one word or one number. So let's select this, the single value response, and let's use the selected question. Now, our question could be, how old are you? Please enter a number in the box below and select the appropriate unit. So remember we said that sometimes you might be doing a survey that is a multi-population survey. For example, if you're doing enhanced that is across the lifespan, and somebody answers, I am 7. Okay, what does 7 mean? Are you 7 days, 7 years, 7 months, 7 decades? We need to know. So in that kind of case, it might be very helpful that in capturing age, we also provide a unit of time, like a unit of measuring time, right? So here, let's do just that. We will give them a box to type their age, and then we'll give them a unit of measurement to select which applies to them. So we've provided a question and an instruction. Let's change the options, the answer input from text to number, because age is a number. And let's configure the inputs so that we tailor it to our own taste. First of all, we're going to say we want measurement units, right? Because we want to make sure that when you enter a number, you provide a unit. Now, this will only apply if our study population is very heterogeneous in terms of the age composition. Like if we're studying a population that ranges from birth to death, right? Anything could be applicable. So we need to make sure that we capture it correctly. So when you wish to use measurement units, the platform already provides you with different types of options here. But it's possible that in this case of age, it may not be there. In fact, it will not be there. So you have to create your own custom options. And to do that, you have this box here where you can just type and add more units. So my units could be, for example, hours. That's very unlikely, but well, it's not impossible. Or days, or weeks, or months, or years, or decades. So these are the different measures of time, right? In this case. So in other words, somebody types 7. Are you 7 hours old or 7 days, right? And let's apply this. And then here, if you want to allow decimal places, you can also check this box to allow decimal places. So let's apply. And this is how the question will look like when the person sees it. How old are you? Please enter a number in the box, which is this box, and select the appropriate unit. This is the units. So they enter the number and then they select that, right? So this is another way we can capture time. Here, we have explicitly allowed the user to provide their age in the box provided, and we've also tried to capture the unit of time. And why are we doing this? Well, to avoid complete confusion when we have a multi-population survey. We don't want to have measurement error. So that is why we're doing this in this case, right? So now we can push this question to our questionnaire. So that's the second way we can capture time. The third way we can capture time is to simply use calendars, right? Where we can capture the day, the month, and all of those things. So let's see how we can do that. Let's add a new question now. And we will also use an open-ended question. But this time, instead of using a single value, we're going to use date time. Date time means it could be date, it could be time, it could be date and time combined. So let's select that. And so, unlike the previous two examples where the individuals could not select a particular day or date, this one allows them to select a date in the date format. So here, let's ask the same question. Please select your, my typing sucks, your date of birth from the options below, right? And so, so our option here is our label here is date of birth, and we can configure the type of inputs that we want, input field, by default is date and time combined. But here we're not interested in date and time. Date and time combined could be for example, a scenario where you're saying, what dates do you want us, what dates and time are available for you to plan our next conference? So you pick a date and I pick a time. Here the question really is just about dates, not date and time. So we're going to change this from date and time combined to date only. And we can configure the inputs to choose the formats of date we want, depending on what we desire, and the time zone. The time zone is important because the platform will standardize the responses to that time zone. You can also set limits for dates. Well, in this case, the limit might be today. You can't be born in the future, obviously, right? At latest, you were born today. So in this case, you might want to set limits for the end date so that users cannot select beyond that date. Or you may want to set limits for the start dates such that individuals could not plausibly select from there. So you might say, oh, I don't think anybody could have been born in 1980, 1840, whatever, or whatever it is you want to set that makes sense to you in your context. You can set it accordingly as the start and end date, and you apply, right? So here, this is how the user will see it. Please select your date of birth from the options below, and then they can then select, right? So let's push that questionnaire. All right, so that's how we can capture dates, right? Let's preview that and see how it looks like from our end. So let's preview the survey. And let's see how that looks like. In what year were you born? Again, this is the option where we selected a drop-down menu and selected the year 1900 as the start and 2025 as the end. So the user can select whatever date it applies to them. How old are you? Again, users can select. They will not be able to submit this response with letters. So if you type GGG, it will tell you, please enter a number, all right? Obviously, you don't want a scenario where you collect this data and then you start having to clean, nonsensical entries. That just adds another layer of difficulty. So here, the user types in the value and selects whether that's in months or years or decades, right? And then please select a date of birth. Again, this allows them to select a year, so they can select a year based on the limits you have provided. If you had said that I'm going to set a limit such that you cannot select future dates, all of these ones will have been grayed out so that the user will not be able to select them. But again, user selects and then they can then submit, right? So these are some of the ways we can capture date and time, and we can put some safeguards depending on whether we're looking at a population level or a multi-population study. We have a lot of options that we can then use to make sure that we are capturing the right thing and that we don't want to spend a lot of time later on with manual data cleaning. All right, so these are some of the guardrails as far as data capture, right? Let me make sure that we do not omit any. All right. Then there are issues of, standardization. Let me quickly show you some examples of that. If we're standardizing data for time, let's look at open-ended date and time. Let's look at the scenario where we're trying to collect time. What time shall we meet for the conference? So here, I want, let's say date and time combined. I want to collect the time in 24 hours military, which is military time, or 12 hours clock. I can specify how I want data to be captured. I can also specify the time zone to standardize the responses. It doesn't help me if I am in the Eastern time zone and you are responding in the West African time zone. If I say, okay, I am available, I want to set limits for dates. I want to set limits for time based on my time zone, right? Your time zone is great, but all I really care about as the investigator is my own time, right? So I want to set a limit that says I am only available between, let's say, 9 a.m., 9:00 a.m., and let's say 6 p.m. Those are the only times that I am available, right? And wherever you are answering from, whether it is in Canada or in Ghana, the system should make sure that it displays to you the equivalent of 9 to 6 in your own time zone. Because remember that all I care about is my time. That's my own availability. It doesn't help me if you said you are available by 10 p.m. That doesn't work for me, right? So in this way, you select the time zone you are in and times that you are available based on that selected time zone. And the platform will enforce that. The user will be displayed the times in their own time zone, but it will be only the times that you are available. Also, in your data sets, the platform will convert all responses to the Eastern time zone, so that you don't have issues of apples and oranges. It doesn't help you at all if in the same data set you have some times in Eastern time zone, some in West African time. Now you now have this additional work to convert all of them to the same time zone. So the platform takes care of all of those things automatically so that you don't have to worry about all of them. All right, let's move on to the analysis now. So now let's say that we have collected our time and we have variables for time and we want to analyze them. How then do we proceed with our analysis? Now let's move away from survey and let's move on to analysis. So let's go to data analysis and let's see how that works. So let's start a new project. Let's call this time series analysis. And let's proceed. So let's upload data sets. First of all, I want us to look at how to parse time, how to manipulate time variables on the Chi-Squares platform before we go into the subject of looking at trends over time. So imagine we have these variables here, dates. We have two date variables. Of course, we can't talk about time without talking about dates. So if you look at this, these are in this format, 05/11/2006, and so on and so forth. When we're analyzing variables that have to do with time or date formats, we have to obviously change them to a form that they can be analyzed. They cannot be analyzed the way they are, right? So whenever you're analyzing time data, that is your first bus stop. The first bus stop is, how do I change this in a form that makes sense for the analysis? Right now, it's string, right? Any software you're analyzing or you're using will always read dates as string, right? Because it's just a bunch of letters, on a bunch of numbers. The fact that you have some characters like slashes completely turns it into string. So that if you look at the visualization for this variable, it's going to return a form of visualization that is more suited for string data. For example, it's going to return a word cloud, right? But your task now is to be able to convert that variable from its string format right now as it is to a form that is more numeric. If I'm doing, for example, trends over time, I may be interested in extracting the variables for year or for months, depending on whatever I want, right? But any time analysis we're doing, the first bus stop is to say, how do we change the variable from a string to a numeric form, right? So let's look at how we can do that. We'll come to data processing, and then we'll come to date transformations. Date transformations, as the name implies, has to do with transforming variables that are dates to another form. So we're going to click on date transformations, and then we're going to select the kind of date transformation that we are interested in. Let's look at the options. The first option is date extraction, which says we want to extract a number or a value from that date. The second one says date interval calculation. In other words, we have two dates, like date of admission and date of discharge, and we want to calculate the interval between those two dates. Or it could be that we have a fixed variable date interval. Maybe you have a date of birth and you want to calculate the individual's age based on or relative to the current date, today's date. So let's look at all three of them and let's see how that works. Let's first go through date extraction. You select the date extraction, you select the variable that you're interested in, which is, for example, date of discharge. The platform automatically will detect the format it's in. This is the hardest part on analyzing dates because the format determines everything, right? And the reason why the platform shows you this is just in the event that you disagree, you can select another format, but this is the format that the platform has detected that these dates are in. Now that you've selected the variable and the platform has detected the formats, now you can choose what you wish to extract from the date, whether it's the year or the month or the day or all three. If it's a year, I can now put the name of the variable year, right, and extract. So let's see how that works out. So we have year. So now you can see that the platform has changed that variable from what it was, which was let's filter the columns to just year. And I think that, we have the other one was date of, I can't remember what it was, discharge or. So as we can see here, yeah, this was date of discharge. From each of the dates, the platform has just extracted that last year, right? So 2016, you see, just 2017, that's what's extracted, 2011, right? This is a completely different variable type than what is here. This is a string variable. These are integers, right? So when we look at the variables we have, again, this is a discrete variable. And if you look at the visualization, it will be visualized as a quantity variable or as an integer, as you can see here, right? So that's the first order of business whenever you're analyzing data that has to do with calendar dates. You have to find a way of converting those dates to a form that can be analyzed quantitatively, because otherwise the dates in of themselves are string and are just qualitative data, right? So that's the first order of business for dates. The date extraction. As we said, you can extract the year, you can extract the month, you can extract the day, or you can extract all three. You don't have to do it one by one. You can select all three, enter the variable names, and the platform will automatically extract those elements that you need and create the new variables. The next is the date interval calculation, which takes two variables, two date variables, and it will automatically calculate the difference between the two of them. So let's choose the first date variable. Let's say our first variable is date of admission. The platform will automatically detect the format it's in. And the second date is, let's say, date of discharge. And again, the platform will automatically detect the format of the variable in between them. And you can choose to preview the selected variable so you can just see what they look like. So here we have date of admission, our date of discharge, so that we can be sure that that's what we selected. And then choose the time unit for expressing the duration between the two dates. In other words, the platform is asking you, do you want the difference between the two expressed in days or in months or in years? So if the difference, for example, is 30 in days, it's just 30. In months, it's one month. And in years, it's 30 over 360, right? Whatever the fraction is. So you can specify whatever value you want, day. it's always best to capture the lowest unit possible because that gives you more precision, right? Saying 30 days is much more precise than saying 30 over 360, right? In terms of, because you have rounding now coming into play, and that rounding creates error in of itself. So it's always best to choose the lowest unit if where applicable. And then you provide the not the name of a transform variable, which could be, let's say, days of admission or days of or hospital stay. And you extract the values in between. So when we check our new variable, hospital stay, hospital stay. So now it's become a continuous variable, right? Those are the variables we have they're just fake variable names. They're just fake variables, fake values. So it doesn't make much sense. And that's why you have negative values. But the point is just a demo to show you how to execute it on your own when you are calculating those things. And then the last procedure is the date transformations that have to do with the interval between one single variable versus a fixed date. So let's say that the variable we're interested in is dates of discharge, and the platform has detected that this is the format it's in. And or let's just pretend that this is your date of birth, and we want to see how old are you relative to today's date. Today's date is this date, right? So now what we're saying is to take a difference between, that date we've supplied for each row against this fixed date. And again, you can express, do you want the answer in years, days, or months? You, as the researcher, it's your data set, so you know the context. In some contexts, it might make more sense expressing it in years. In other contexts, it might make more sense expressing it in months or days. It's your data set, you know better. So you select the value you want, and then again, as before, you supply the name of a transformed variable, and the platform will then make the change. So that's how you transform variables to convert them. But again, I cannot emphasize enough that please don't take a date variable in its raw form, like date of admission, and try to use it. It makes no sense. You have to first of all transform it into a form that can be analyzed, right? And that could mean extracting elements that are relevant. All right, now our next task is to say, okay, how do we analyze trends? Let's say we want to look at something like this, right? How do we generate where's our table? Yes, something like this. So we're looking at trends over time. So this, for example, looks at trends in cigarettes and other products over time. How do we do that? Well, it's very, very simple on the chi-square platform. All you do is simply come to estimates and come to prevalence. Is it trends in means or trends in prevalence? Prevalence is like a percentage, 0 or 1. So if you're looking at, let's say, smoking, you are looking at the percentage of people who smoke and how that has changed over time. And so that will be a measure of prevalence. In our design of a chi-square platform, we try to avoid overwhelming users with so many options, right? Our goal is to make things more simple, not more complicated. So one of the things we avoid is just giving you a very long list of many options. So yeah, it's just struggling to even find what procedure you want to run. So the way we've done that is to really, really pack a lot of things into as many options as possible. So when you are running analysis here, you won't see something like trend analysis or time series. That's because, well, we've captured it under different menus. So here, if you're looking at prevalence trends, you come to prevalence. And so under that, the options are choose your outcome variables, choose your stratification variables, and very importantly, choose the time variable for trend analysis. If your analysis does not involve trends, then you don't have to select this. If your analysis involves trends, then you have to select it. It's that simple, right? Now let's upload a data set that has actual trend data, and let's see how that goes. But let's first of all explain this this measures. The outcome variables are the variables that you care about for your outcome. So for example, here we're looking at 20-year trends in cigarettes and cigars and roll your own and all of that. Those are our outcome variables. So those are what we're going to select as our outcomes. Then the next option given to you is to select, let me close some of these pages. I have too many tabs open. Let me close this too. All right. So the next is you have to select stratification variables. Stratification variables are variables that you want to stratify the trends upon. So here, for example, we see the trends in this result stratified by sex and age and race, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. Those are our stratification variables, right? So here we have discussed the outcome variables, then the stratification variables, and then your time variable. The time variable must be an integer. So you cannot go and bring a calendar, variable in its raw form. You have to first of all transform it, as we have seen in the previous demonstration. So you convert it to an integer. If it's year you want to look at, if you're interested in trends over year, then you extract year. If it's trend over months, you extract months. So you hear things like annual trends or year-on-year trends or month-on-month trends. Well, that means that they extracted a year or they extracted a month and then run a trend. So that's the first thing you have to do. So let's upload a data set and let's replace this data set with a variable that has to do with trends. This is a very heavy data set, so this might take a second. It's massively large. Okay, so when you import data set into the Kiteexpress platform, one of the things it does at the very beginning is that it scans the variable names to make sure that your variable names do not contain things that will cause problems. So in this case, if your variable names are all fine, great. You will not even know that check has been done. But if your variable names contain characters that will cause problem in analysis, the platform will flag them and say, hey, you have a problem here, like you just did now. So here it's telling me that one variable in my data set has an illicit character. A variable name cannot start with dot. So that's the problem here clearly. So all I need to do is to click here to rename the variable. So I'm going to click there. And the platform has suggested a name for me already. It has just removed the dots. So let's rename. Oh, okay. We have an ID variable already. So I'm just going to call this ID2 and rename. And that should do the trick. Aha. So now our data set has been fully imported. So let's now look at how we can set up our trend analysis for demonstration purposes. So in this case, let's say we want to do trends in cigarette smoking over time. So what we'll do is, since cigarette is a categorical variable, we'll come to estimate and we'll come to prevalence, because prevalence has to do with categorical variables. In this case, we're interested in trends in cigarettes and maybe cigars. So we select prevalence. Now we have to select the variables that we care about. We're looking at trends in smoking of cigarettes. So let's select our outcomes as cigarettes, let's see. All right, cigarette is here and cigar, and let's say electronic cigarettes. So let's say that those are the trends, those are the variables we're interested in. And so we'll select them, I will click on done selecting. So far, all we've done is we selected our outcomes. And in this case, we're interested in trends in cigarettes, cigar, and electronic cigarettes. So in other words, it's like these variables we have here, right? And we're saying, how has smoking prevalence changed over time? And how has cigar smoking prevalence changed over time? And the same thing with electronic cigarettes. And the platform allows you to enter up to 20 variables as outcomes. So you must supply at least one variable, and you can supply up to 20 variables or so for the outcomes. I cannot remember the exact number, but I think it's pretty high. Next is our stratification variables for our trend. Because remember, the platform will automatically do everything for you in the background. So it's just asking you, supply all the variables that you want to use as stratification variables. So let's say here we want to include a variable like sex, male and female. And let's say we also want to include something like race. Let's see if we have race here. Yes, we do have race. Race in, let's see. Let's use this. This has 4 unique values, 4 categories. So let's select that. And again, you can add as many stratification variables as you want. For the sake of this demo, we'll just keep it at 2. Next, you have to choose your time variable for trend analysis. If our analysis did not involve trends, we wouldn't need this variable. So that means that the platform will just analyze it for one point in time, right? But once you select a variable here, that signifies to the platform that your analysis is trend analysis, right? So remember, the goal of, we want to keep things really simple and not overwhelm the user with too many options at the beginning. So we've kept the UI in the interface very simplified. So the way you indicate that you are trying to do a trend analysis is by selecting this variable for time. Once you select time, we know that you're looking at trends over time, temporal trends. So here, I'm going to select my trend variable, my time variable. I believe it's year. Yes, year. So here, trends were measured over 8 years. So I select that. So those are the only selections I need to make. I select the variables, I select the stratification variables, and then I select my year. And then I can also select whether I want the analysis to be among a subset of the population or among the entire data set. And now I can click on estimate. Now, trend analysis can take a minute because it's quite a complex procedure that is taking place in the background. And so what the platform is doing is that it looks at the time variable you have supplied to it. It checks the interval between the times and sees, okay, these intervals, are they fixed and the same, or do the intervals vary, over the the unique values of that time variable. So if the intervals are not the same, the platform knows that, okay, we have to do some extra work. We have to, for example, introduce orthogonal polynomials to correct for that differences in the intervals. It then goes ahead to check whether it needs to include quadratic terms if the trends are linear or curvilinear, right? So there are a million things the platform is doing behind the background. So the bottom line is, if you are trying to look for trends, it may not take place in 1 second. It might take several seconds or even a couple of minutes. Oh, in this case, it's finished. It's trend analysis. Here we have the predictor of interest. We have a category of interest, and we have the outcome. And this is the trends for the different periods of time assessed. The prevalence in 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Those are the unique values for the time variable that we were interested in. Then the platform gives you the relative percentage change as well as the annual percentage change for the indicators, right? So you have both the relative as well as the annual percentage change. So the relative percentage change is simply the final year minus the first year divided by the first year. So in other words, 6.8 minus 12.2 divided by 12.2. That's what we mean by the relative percentage change. The platform also gives you the annual percentage change. Now, the annual percentage change is different from the relative percentage change because whereas the relative percentage change looks at only the first and last year, the annual percentage change is saying at what rate do you have a change of 1 year relative to the previous year as its own baseline. So every single point in time is being used, right? So in other words, here we're saying that we're seeing a 0.8% decline from year to year, right? This one is saying that when we compare the prevalence in the final year compared to the very first year, it's just looking at not the rate of change, but just saying the relative difference between the two is minus 44.2. So they tell you very, very different things. So in this case, here we'll see the trends analyzed, and then we also see the P trend. The P value here is the P value for trend. So P trend. So it's checking, okay, this trend, is it significant, right? If the result is not significant, that means that what we are seeing is not really a trend, it's just a fluctuation. So remember we talked about fluctuation versus trends. That's what it means, right? If the trends are not significant, that means that the only inference is that, well, it's not significant, it's not a significant trend, which implies that it's a fluctuation over time, right? So here we can see that there was a decrease, but that decrease is not statistically significant, meaning that it was just overall just a fluctuation, right? So the platform gives you the data in terms of the table that is formatted for publication. It also gives you a plot of the data where you have the years over here, and then the visualization of the data. You also have the text. Very importantly, the platform also writes out the result for you in form of a text so that you can capture the results in text form as well. So that that way you can focus on making sense of what the results mean for you in terms of practice or public health implications. Now let's look at a bit of a methodology. So joint point regression analysis was executed to analyze changes in the prevalence of the trend of prevalence estimates at 8 equally spaced time periods. So what's happening behind the scenes is the platform uses joint point regression. Joint point regression is just a form of regression where we're looking at trends or an event, in this case prevalence, and saying at what point do we have inflection in the data. In this case, the time periods are equally spaced. So the platform accordingly adjusts the appropriate analysis to fit that. A quadratic term was inserted into the model to capture any non-linear trends and improve fit. What does that mean? Well, when we analyze trends, we like to assume that we have a linear model, that there's a linear relationship between time and the event occurring. But that's a very dangerous assumption, right? If you assume that the trend is linear, but in reality it is not linear, you have a problem on your hand, and that problem is called model misspecification. So the question is, what should you do? Well, if there's any suspicion that the trend is in fact not linear, it is better to add a curvilinear model or a curvilinear term, right, that captures the non-linear parts of the trend, as opposed to just hoping and praying that things are linear, right? That makes sure that your model fits the data better. So here the platform accounts for the curvilinear trends in the data by adding a quadratic trend into the model to capture any non-linear trends. So the rest just says that it calculates both annual percentage change in addition to the relative percentage changes that we have seen. So at this point, if we want to push our results to the manuscript, all we need to do is just actions and click on push results. Let's create a new manuscript and let's call it trends in the use of tobacco products among US middle and high school students. let's use AI to generate the aims. So I'm just going to select a couple here and start writing. So we're going to push. So now the content has been pushed. Let's view the documents. Let's see how that has been moved to the manuscript. All right, let's resolve the variables so that they are human readable. And let's look at our. So this is the content the platform has pushed from our analysis. Let me make this a bit smaller. So we have our analysis written out here. And then we have our table as discussed earlier. We have the point estimates and the 95% confidence intervals that show for overall as well as by stratum. So here, for example, this is the overall prevalence for cigarettes for each year. This is the relative percentage change. This is the annual percentage change. And this is the p-value, which is a p-trend, right? So we have that for all the subgroups and all the products. In this case, we looked at cigarettes, cigars, and I believe electronic cigarettes. So the three products we used. And so the platform calculates that for us and also writes out the results. So that is, in a nutshell, how the platform allows you to be able to analyze trends. So in this case, it looks at the data, and if it spots any anomalies, it automatically adjusts the required analysis to fit the data accordingly. Now, sometimes you might be interested in looking at the impact of an intervention. Let's say at a particular point in time, an intervention was implemented. So we want to see how does this intervention influence the outcome of interest. For example, we passed a law in 2017, and we're trying to see how does that law have an impact. How do we do that? There are many ways to do that. The simplest way is to simply recode that time variable so that we have a before and after. So let's go to data processing and let's recode our time variable. So that's year. Let's recode this variable. So this is the time variable we have. So let's say that our intervention was implemented in 2014 or 2015. And we're trying to say, okay, did that intervention have an impact? So what we're saying is that the simplest way to analyze that data will be to say, let's create a time period before and after. So if your intervention was implemented in 2014, you should bear in mind that there will be a latent period. There will be a period where it takes time for things to happen. Things don't just happen overnight, right? So if intervention occurred in 2014, it might make sense for us to say, okay, we're going to look at from 2011 to 2014 as the pre-period, and then from 15 to 18 as the post period, right? So we're going to just say, we're going to collapse these periods in time together. And then this other ones too, right? So now we have two periods in time. We can call this the pre and we can call this the post. And let's proceed. So we can call this like tobacco or policy or tobacco law, right? So now our intervention is pre and post, and our goal is to see how does this policy have an impact, right? So now we will simply fit an appropriate regression. We're trying to see our outcome of interest being, for example, current cigarette smoking. What is the relationship between the pre and post indicator and tobacco use, right? That's essentially what we're asking. So we could use, for example, a Poisson regression model or a logistic regression model and analyze that outcome. So if we were to use, for example, a logistic regression model, would come to regression analysis, would select the outcome of interest, would select the major the outcome, which is, for example, current cigarette smoking. We'll select our main predictor. In this case, that is tobacco law. That's our most important predictor, right? How does, the tobacco law influence tobacco use? We will hope to see that compared to the pre-period, the post-period, there was, maybe 25% lower odds of smoking, right? That's kind of what we would expect. But of course, we can never tell until we test the data empirically. We may also have other, predictors like age and sex, won't obviously control for them. But this is how we could set up our results in that context. So let's select other predictors that we might be interested in. We might be interested in, sex and let's say race as potential confounders. So here, we're adding those other variables as confounders. A confounder is a variable that is associated with the exposure and with the outcome and does not lie on the causal pathway, right? So we could include some of those variables, race, and all of those things, and then analyze to see how this major variable here is associated with our outcome, which is current cigarette smoking. So that's one way we could do it. There are other ways to do it, obviously, but that would be the easiest way. So let's click on estimate now. All right, so while that runs, are there any questions? Somebody asked a question earlier about, but what if our intervention involves, if we don't have one single intervention, but there are many, many interventions together, right? That was a question asked. For example, we might have, let's open a document here and look at some of the things that might be implicated based on that question that the user asked originally. So let's say that we have intervention. Intervention one is, let's say, smoke-free law. And intervention two is, let's say, a increase in tax. And then our intervention three is, let's say, warning labels on tobacco products. So the question I was asking, how do we test all three of them, right? They were all implemented in the same year. Well, in terms of time series, then it becomes impossible to separate the effects of all three. That's the unfortunate reality. If you implemented all things at the same time, well, you can't tease apart the different impact of one versus the other, right? At least not with observational data anymore. So if, however, you want to capture the implications or the impact of, let's say, those interventions in an experimental setting, then we can explore that, right? So if, for example, you're interested in looking at it experimentally, you can have a factorial experiment, for example. Factorial experiment is where we have two studies for the price of one. So if my study is, let's say, looking at the impact of exposure to, let's say, plain packaging. So plain packaging is one intervention. And let's say my second intervention is, let's say, the color of tobacco packaging, right? You can have a factorial experiment where I combine those two into one experiment. So one group is exposed to, for example, plain packages that are red in color, the other to plain packages that are green, and so on, right? But if the interventions are all occurring at the same point in time in an observational context, then well, we cannot separate them. We can, however, say that comprehensive tobacco control measures were found to have this impact, the reduced smoking prevalence by X%, right? But that is now looking at it comprehensively, not one versus the other, because of course, if everything is measured together, or if everything occurs together, then it becomes impossible to tease out the different impacts of the different ones. Now, if they occur at different points in time, it's possible, but still challenging, right? Because it takes time in general for policies to have an impact. If I implemented, let's say, smoke-free laws 1 year ago, and then this year I implemented something else, well, it's hard to know that the thing I'm seeing today is not from intervention yesterday, right? Because one, it takes some time for the intervention I implemented last year to kick in, right? And so what I'm capturing here is the impact of, what was implemented yesterday plus what was implemented today, right? So that's why we want to be very cautious with trying to make any kind of causal inference, especially when we have those kind of population level interventions where it is very hard to say there is a silver bullet that this was a magic intervention. So the reality is that in the real world, interventions work together to have a combined effect on whatever outcome we're interested in measuring. There are ways where, of course, we can use, natural experiments, which we also call, quasi-experiments, but that is always very good when we have one population that was cleanly exposed, and we don't have another population that was exposed, and we're using that one as a benchmark, right? So it's a different thing if, let's say, in this population we had plain packaging, right, implemented as a law, covers the whole population. I will look to the neighboring population and say, oh, you guys don't have plain packaging. Now let's compare cigarette smoking rates between our population and your population, right? Now it's a bit clean because you have one group that was not exposed at all. So we need to think outside the box a little, whether we want to use experimental settings, for example, discrete choice, experiments, or or factorial experiments, or whether I want to use quasi experiments in cases of policy. But those things are sometimes quite challenging to capture if we're interested in very clean effects. All right, any other questions? I see some hands up. Yeah, Maureen.
Okay, thank you, Prof, for the wonderful session so far. Please, my question is regarding this intervention stuff. So let's take, for instance, COVID-19 and non-masking intervention like this lockdown, use of nose masks that were implemented. So the first question is, when you were working, you were able to, like we had data set from 2011, and you were saying, okay, what if the intervention was implemented 2014? So it's easier to match like the years prior to be able to get the pre-intervention and the years after as the post-intervention. But in the case of COVID-19, where let's say the incident rate started 2020, and like just like a week or so the intervention we already implemented, how do you really separate the pre and post? So that's one. The second question is, now you talked about that if the interventions were implemented like almost the same time, which like use of nose masks the social distancing lockdown, they were actually implemented like almost the same time. Is there like other ways that we can use? I know you talked about natural experiment, checking if maybe a particular city is not that did not have that implementation at the same time. But is there any other way, practical way that we can use to be able to categorize, like know how maybe school closure impacted that COVID-19 outcome within that time, to be able to know which one, if it was school closure of lockdown or nose masks? Yeah. Thank you, Prof.
All right, thanks so much. So let me show you a paper that we did that let me pull it up quickly. That shows how you would want to think about that. Let's see. Let's see if I can pull this paper. We published a paper in JAMA that looked at this very same thing. I think it would be helpful to, if I can find it. If not, I'll just tell you what it says. But it would have been very nice to. Okay, you know what? I'll share the paper with you afterwards. It would have been very nice because it answers your question specifically. But so here's the deal. Scenario number one, you painted. You have COVID started today, and you do not have data before that. And let's say on day one, interventions were implemented, and you want to see the impact of those interventions. Well, you can't. There's no comparison period. You need a comparator. So when we talk about the PICO framework, PICOT, we talk about intervention and comparison, right? So even when we're looking at trends over time or time series data, we need to have had a period of time when nothing was done, and then we have an intervention during that point in time that introduces a shock into the system. Then we can say, that's what we call it. Another type of analysis that is done in this regard is called an ITS, interrupted time series. Why is it called interrupted? Because you had time coming on, time going along, and then we interrupted the time with an intervention. Interruption means in the middle, we did something. But you can't say, oh, at the very start when there was nothing, we implemented something and we want to evaluate it. There's nothing you can do about that. You can only describe. If everybody was exposed, then there is no comparator to draw inference. It's impossible. That cannot be done, right? You can only calculate things when you have some people who are exposed and others who are not exposed. Now, that, if you had another population that was not exposed, then you can compare them, right? But at least there is a comparator. So without a comparator, you cannot make those kind of inferences. The only thing you can do is just say descriptive analysis that said, we implemented this on day one. We noticed that year on year or week on week, we saw continuous decreases in this. But you cannot talk about you cannot make an inference relative to the intervention because you don't have a control. So we should make that very clear in our minds. You need a comparator, either within the same population or to a control population to be able to make any kind of inference. And that's what we call analytical epidemiology, right? It always involves a comparison. To your other question about you have mask and you have, let's say, school shutdowns, and you have a whole bunch of things all implemented simultaneously. Well, it's very, very hard to tease apart the impact of just one of them on the other, right? Because on the outcomes we care about. How can you? Because you've implemented all of them. So instead of you thinking of them as implementation A or intervention A, B, C, think of them as comprehensive interventions, right? that makes more sense in the context of, okay, geez, now we have all of those things together. And really, in public health, we don't really care which one worked to what extent. I mean, we always implement them as comprehensive sets. In tobacco control, for example, we always talk about comprehensive tobacco control measures. We are never going to say just implement A, B, and C, but don't implement X and Y. We will never say that. We always recommend, let us implement comprehensive tobacco control measures. When we're talking about interventions, we always say there's evidence that comprehensive tobacco control measures work. Why do we say that? Well, because that's what we measured. We realized that it's almost impossible in some cases for us to just separate out this clean intervention or that clean intervention, because they're always implemented together. The only time we can do that is if they were implemented in isolation. Then we can capture. But it's like saying, oh, you have a vaccine that was given to people, and you want to separate which ingredient in that vaccine made the patient to recover. It's impossible to measure it because the vaccine was administered together as one unit. So you can't say, oh, is it ingredient A in this vaccine that worked, or is it ingredient B? It's impossible. Why? Because the vaccine is one unit, one comprehensive package that was implemented. The only time we can tell A versus B is if we are able to separate them, and most times we're not able to separate them. Okay, any other questions? So, from my regression, just to make sure we close out the loop. In this case here, our tobacco law pre or post, we see that compared to the pre, this is just a hypothetical scenario, apparently. But compared to the odds of smoking were 0.6 times lower among the post compared to pre, right? So this is a very simple way in which we could, for example, interpret the result. But again, the reality is, yeah, we typically do not have the ability to tease apart, very unique interventions as what caused this. That's why in public health, those things are very, very hard to capture. All right, any other questions? I think we're on time now.
I can read one.
Okay, sure.
Let's say you are estimating the effect of IRS intervention on malaria incidence for a period of time. Can the chi-squares platform design a before and after time series graph which shows the change in malaria incidence when the IRS intervention was introduced?
Well, the platform can show you trends over time, and you can then the specific period when intervention was implemented. Or better yet, some things are better done as custom graphs. So it might even be better for you to create that custom graph yourself, because it might just capture the nuances of what you want better.
Thank you. How do you interpret the p-values in this very example?
Okay, let's see. So in this case, in this very example, we see that the variable or the predictor variable is tobacco law. The reference group is pre. So we're comparing post to pre. I'll see that the odds of smoking were 0.6 times lower among the posts compared to the pre. And this relationship is statistically significant. We know that it's statistically significant based on the fact that, number one, the confidence intervals do not include 1, and also the p-value is small. P-value in this case is less than 0.01, which supports the finding here that indeed there's a significant difference. In general, think of S equals S. When the p-value is small, we say the results are significant, right? That's how you can remember it. Think of S equals S. If it's small, it's significant. So here, we're looking to see, is this smaller than the threshold we have set, which is 0.05, right? In that case, we declare it significant. So if you see here, the platform also reports it accordingly here. So here it says the following factors were inversely associated with cigarette smoking at P less than 0.05, which is the threshold. Race F coded as 2 black versus 1 white. The odds ratios were 0.51, 95% CI, 0.48 to 0.55. Tobacco law coded as post versus pre. Again, the odds ratio is 0.6 with 95% CI, 0.57 to 0.62. So again, that means that when we look at the result here, it just means that our results are statistically significant. So in other words, that yes, there was a 40% lower odds of smoking in the post period compared to the pre-period. And that this is not just noise, it's a true signal. So that's how we interpret it in a very simple way.
Thank you, Prof. Are there any other questions? Okay. There are no questions, Prof.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. I'll see you tomorrow then.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Longile.
Dr. Ben, thank you.
Ha 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 ha.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
We appreciate you too. Thank you for joining. Attendance link. Ah.